Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Saff. Today, we're joined by Mr. Seán Binder, an inspirational human rights activist who has volunteered in Lesbos as a rescue diver. Seán and his team provided first aid and immediate support to refugees in distress, offering life-saving assistance to people fleeing war, persecution, or hardship with no other way to reach safety. For his humanitarian work, Seán and the other aid workers faced criminal charges in Greece. Seán spent 106 days in pre-trial detention and could face up to 20 years in prison if found guilty. Since 2018, this case has violated several of Seán's fundamental rights, including freedom from arbitrary detention and the right to a fair trial without undue delay. Several international organizations described his case as the criminalization of humanitarian acts, stating that he and his colleagues should have never faced trial for their human rights work. The Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has called for all charges to be dropped. The Article 14 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights affirms that everyone has the right to seek asylum from persecution in other countries. Article 2 of European Convention on Human Rights explicitly protects the right to life, and the EU Facilitation Directive of 2002 protects humanitarian actions intended to save lives. Seán's case is thus not only a symbol of criminalization for acts of solidarity, but also a defense of European law and values. In 2024, 91 people were prosecuted in the EU for crossing borders irregularly in the Mediterranean, not including the UK due to Brexit. These figures likely undercount the true scale of criminalization. In the same year, 2,200 people died or went missing while attempting to reach Europe. Each statistic represents a life, a person with hopes, dreams, and families. There is no guarantee that anyone will not one day be forced to flee their home due to conflict or persecution. And for those currently facing these dangers, the lack of safe routes often leaves them with no choice but to take highly risky journeys. The work of humanitarian workers, rescuers, and activists who provide assistance is increasingly criminalized. In 2024 alone, 142 individuals faced criminal or administrative proceedings in the EU for acts of solidarity. Alarmingly, this criminalization has no clear limit. It can extend to anyone showing compassion. Helping those in need, even in accordance with international and European law, can put ordinary people at risk. So without further ado, I'll be asking my first question to Seán. So I'm wondering what first drew you to do humanitarian work in Lesbos, and could you tell us a bit more about your role and how your typical day looks like?
Sure, of course. Preface by saying I think you've summarized the issues perfectly.
Mhm.
You've basically taken the words out of my mouth, so I'm going to keep it quite brief now. But yes, I think as you've summarized it, it exactly hits at the problem that we're facing. Um, but that wasn't clear to me when I first started doing search and rescue voluntary work all the way back in 2017. The way I got into this work is I suppose a combination of two things. I felt I understood what was happening, and I felt I had some of the skills that might be helpful in alleviating the horrific deaths that we see in the Mediterranean, or more particularly in the North Aegean Sea between Greece and Turkey. So I was doing my master's degree, much like you are now in London, in 2016, and focused on European defense and security policy. And as I'm sure you remember, 2016 was the peak of this so-called European migration crisis. In particular, the harrowing images of people drowning were shared quite publicly. But because I was doing the European Defense and Security Policy master's degree, I understood that the way that the European Union responds to people drowning in our seas is not by helping them, but by defending and securing against them. That is, in effect, abandoning them out at sea, oftentimes. So I understood this policy context, and having grown up in Ireland, having grown up by the sea, I had done some search and rescue training as a scuba diver. I had spent some time on yachts and on boats, and so I felt I also had some skills. And so I combined my policy understanding as I thought I had it after my master's degree with my practical skills that I'd learned as a child and as a teenager to go and volunteer. And I joined a Greek search and rescue NGO called Emergency Response Center International, or ERCI. And I joined as a boat crew member. Now, we have this view, I think, of search and rescue being this very exciting activity, but in fact, if I'm honest with you, I did very little. Spent most of my time doing training. So in the daytime, get up. We all lived in the same large building. We had about 4 to 6 bunk beds in a room, and we were crammed in. So we get up in the morning, have a communal breakfast. It sounds a bit like a cult now that I think back on it. We had breakfast together, and then we'd go out, maybe do some exercise, some training, maybe go out on the sea with our ribs, our search and rescue rigid hull inflatable boats, and do some training, do a couple of shifts. We also had shifts in the local camps. We had a clinic and we did site management in one of the camps, so it might have helped out there. And then really at night, in the hours of midnight to 7 a.m., I would stand at the shoreline with a colleague, or someone would stand there. And you have to imagine it this way. Lesbos Island is very close to Turkey. It's only a couple of miles away. You can actually see the lights of the traffic in Turkey twinkling if you stand at the shoreline in Lesbos, which I hope indicates why or suggests why the journey is such an important one because it's relatively close. A lot of asylum seekers, refugees, and migrants go on small boats to try and cross. And so what I do from midnight to 7 a.m. is stand at the shoreline and just listen. You listen for the screaming of people or small boat engine sounds, anything that might indicate there's a boat in distress. And then if there is, we'd respond to it. Then after, if we do respond to it, we would call the Coast Guard and have the authorities pick up the people we've assisted and take them for identification and registration within the asylum process system. So that is pretty much the daily routine that I experienced for about 9 months as I volunteered.
So, just a quick question about this. So you would work with the coast guards of Greece, and would you work with other legal authorities in Greek?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yes, exactly. So one of the reasons that I joined ERCI is because it had a good relationship with the authorities.
Mhm.
At the time, it was important to me because in my view, having 20-something-year-olds coordinate civilian search and rescue as I was not right. This is a job that should be done by the authorities. Obviously, in their ideal world, there would be no need for search and rescue because people wouldn't need to find refuge in another country. And in a better world, of course, the authorities, that is the Coast Guard or the Navy, would be doing this kind of search and rescue work. But unfortunately, in the world in which we live, there's a gap in service.
Mhm.
There are thousands, tens of thousands. In fact, as of last month, there are over 33,000 deaths in the Mediterranean, people drowned. And it's not because we don't have the resources to assist them, it's because we choose not to do so.
Mhm.
So if there is no civilian search and rescue, then people will drown. In fact, people still drown anyway. But my hope was really that I would work with the authorities. And so I joined the RCI because it had that relationship. And what that meant was we would, for example, communicate constantly with the Coast Guard. I would email them or communicate with them almost every single day, whether at the shoreline, where we stood shoulder to shoulder, sometimes responding to boats in distress, or via email when I informed them who would be on the boat crew, who would go out to sea, who would be training. And so they're very much aware of our movements. And then, of course, we also provided them with key training. We, for example, trained the local police how to do CPR, which you might think is surprising given that they probably ought to be able to do so without us. Or indeed, at the same time that I was on the island, there was a UK border force vessel called the Valiant. It was operating as part of a Frontex mission. Frontex is the European Coast Guard. The Valiant was on the island of Lesbos while I was there, and I once got an email from a medic aboard the Valiant asking me if we could replenish their medical supplies because they didn't have any. What I'm trying to say is that we worked with the Coast Guard and with Frontex and with the Navy because they needed our assistance.
I think it's very important what you highlighted, the state's role. that should protect the right to life and also the right to seek asylum. Um, and I think what you highlighted first is also really important that things we learn at universities and at master's levels should not be left just on paper, writing essays and moving on with our days. Um, it gives us the responsibility to act on the knowledge that we know. So my
Yes,
second,
I
yeah, go ahead.
no, please go.
Um, my other question would be, so it's been a while since you worked as a rescue diver, but what is the current situation in Greece? Are there other humanitarian works that are happening?
Yes, it has been a while since I was doing search and rescue. Um, and one of the important developments of my own prosecution isn't so much that I now face 20 years in prison, Saff. It is that people like you also face it. It's that all of us who are engaged in humanitarian activity or in showing solidarity or insisting on the application and the access of all people to their human rights, all of us face prosecution. And I think that point really became clear to me the day after I was put into pre-trial prison, because on that day, the civilian search and rescue organizations that I had worked with stopped working because they were afraid that they too could be targeted. And from my perspective, that's exactly the goal behind these kinds of prosecutions. As you have highlighted in your introduction, every human rights organization, all legal experts who have looked at our case file have said, we're guilty of nothing. So the real reason these are being brought, these prosecutions like the one that I face, is to try and scare people away in the interim period between the initial investigation all the way to acquittal after trial. That being said, while there are now far fewer search and rescue organizations on Lesbos and indeed in Greece and indeed across Europe, there are still organizations on Lesbos that do humanitarian work, whether it be food distribution, provision of assistance, for example, legal assistance or protection assistance. Those services continue to be provided. What's frightening, though, is even if they're not directly at the border, as we were in a search and rescue maritime capacity, they also face prosecution at times or at other times, kind of bureaucratic hurdles. So, a mounting difficulty in being able to provide services by just putting certain requirements, regulatory requirements, paperwork requirements in front of these organizations that, in my view, are being put to them in an effort to make their work more difficult. And that is indeed what some humanitarians are reporting.
Mhm. Can you tell us how long has, so when were you put in detention, pre-trial detention, and what was your experience and how it affected you personally and professionally?
Sure. So I was first arrested in February of 2018. But this arrest, I thought, was perhaps an initial error. This happened on one night. We were detained for about 2 nights following that in the local police station. And we were released again pending further investigation. And we really thought at this point, well, nothing's going to happen. The Coast Guard know us, the police know us, we've been in constant communication. There's some mistake here. And so we continued volunteering. And yet 6 months later, me and my colleagues were arrested again. And this time we were detained in pretrial detention for over 100 days, as you've said. And this is when several things happened in my life. Um, One, of course, is that I suddenly was in detention and I lost my freedom. A moment crystallized in my mind when I was handcuffed to a man convicted of murder. And I know I've done nothing wrong. And yet I was being treated in a way as though I had committed one of the most heinous crimes, like taking a life. We were being treated in exactly the same way. And it brought into sharp relief in my mind how you mentioned European values earlier, how little they mean in practice, and how they are completely meaningless unless we, as European citizens and as particularly European member states, are willing to uphold them. And unfortunately, it seems to me as though we are unwilling to uphold them as member states of the European Union. We merely pay lip service to them because we're far more likely to try and prioritize security concerns over our values. The irony, I think, of course, is that I'm told constantly we need to protect our borders from outsiders because we need to protect our European values. So the idea is, well, we have peace and we have justice in the European Union. These are our values, and outsiders will, of course, diminish those. The irony is that if you lock your border down and if you abandon people to drown in our oceans, then we've already lost those values. The very act of trying to preserve those values loses them. And the consequences is so deadly. So on the one hand, I felt an immense shame and suppose a being let down by Europe and all that it aspires to do. And on the other hand, it also opened up a pathway for me that I had never seen before. I met folks in prison, and as ever, Saff, you'll be aware of this, but the people who have the fewest human rights to begin with are those that suffer most when further human rights are eroded. And that, in this case, are, of course, migrants, asylum seekers, and refugees, many of whom find themselves in prison, charged and indeed convicted of the same thing that I'm being charged with, yet without the legal support that they need. And so, having met them in prison, I thought I would like to become a lawyer. I'd like to be able to help people like this because I was powerless to do so while I was in prison. And having also seen my own lawyers advocate for me in the courthouse, um, it opened up in my mind this route of a future. So, from a professional perspective, which you asked about, I have since then used my experience to retrain as a lawyer, and now I'm a barrister here in London working on criminal law. For obvious reasons, I'm interested in criminal law.
I think it's very inspiring how you've used your previous experiences to keep on helping people who are in need the most to highlight. And I just want to add on the European values you've mentioned. And Frontex is a private company that protects so-called the EU borders. So I hope maybe our listeners can have a think about how much profit they've been making each year and how many people have been drowning ever since.
You can go onto the Frontex website and you can look at the mission statement, and they have quite an extensive list of goals. And if this is ostensibly the European Coast Guard agency, you'd expect it to say fairly high up the saving of lives at sea or saving of lives in general at our borders. None of it. It's not one of its priorities. Its priorities are clearly stated as counter smuggling and stopping crimes happening at the border. And while that is natural and only right that it should be one of its priorities, to not at all prioritize saving lives, given that the Mediterranean is the deadliest sea crossing in the world, I find absolutely shameful.
And then this leads me to my next question. So, um, how does your experience fit into a wider criminalization of solidarity across Europe? So, do you know a little more about other countries, what's happening in Italy, France, maybe the UK?
Hmm. Yeah, it's as you've hinted at in your introduction, already, that this is a wider phenomenon. Um, and as I have said earlier, the real frightening thing isn't that I can be prosecuted, it's that if I can be prosecuted, then anyone can be. I once received this email of solidarity from a German-speaking pastor in Switzerland. His name was Norbert Valley, and he was prosecuted because he let asylum seekers sleep in his church during a storm. If acts as obviously helpful and kind as that can be prosecuted, then I am really afraid that we are criminalizing the very act of being in solidarity, the act of being helpful to this, the act of trying to uphold some basic decency and our legal requirements that we have established in various human rights conventions. But this is a far larger thing still than just one pastor and us 24 defendants. There were, at least when I most recently looked, at least 142 individuals across the European continent, I think across the European Union actually, of humanitarians being prosecuted. And of them, I think, let me just check the figures. Yeah, I think 62 of those were in Greece, but the rest were scattered around Europe. And that includes Italy, France, Poland, Latvia, Malta, Cyprus, Bulgaria, many countries. And so it really isn't isolated. This is a Europe-wide problem, a Europe-wide effort to try and frighten people who are engaged in necessary human rights work. And in fact, that figure that I gave you is probably an undercount. I think you're probably familiar with the organization that conducted it. They're a fantastic organization called Pickham. And I think their study is probably the best one and most up-to-date one presently, but they themselves admit or acknowledge that their methodology is limited because they, of course, focus the way they find cases is by reviewing media articles that refer to cases, and not all cases will be mentioned in the media, particularly cases against other asylum seekers and refugees, who I'm afraid to say are almost always completely ignored.
I guess this highlights the chilling effect that your case has uh, been used for, and probably why it's been taking so long and breaching your fundamental rights. And so I want to talk more about your trial coming up in December. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes, of course. So our trial in December, we hope will be the final installment in this rather years-long saga. For the past 7 years, we've been waiting for this particular trial. I should just highlight that the charges that I face have been split into two. There are basically two tiers. The first one are misdemeanors. Those are the lowest crimes. And then there are the felonies, these are the more serious crimes that I'm alleged to have committed. And we've been waiting for the felony trial since 2018 now. And you would think that, put it this way, if the prosecution really thought we were these heinous criminals, then they would want us behind bars as quickly as possible. And if they had any shred of evidence that we did anything wrong at all, then we would presumably be in prison already. And yet it is we, the defendants, who have been pushing for trial every year, trying to get this trial listed, and it's the prosecution that has dragged its heels. But finally now, in December, on the 4th, we will go to Lesbos and have a felony trial to find out, to once and for all determine whether we are, in fact, as the prosecution allege, smugglers, members of a criminal organization, and in my case, in fact, they think I'm the mastermind of the criminal organization, and money launderers. If we're found guilty, we face 20 years imprisonment. It will be immediate custody. So basically, after the trial in December, or possibly in early January, we will go to prison or be acquitted. That is effectively what we're facing.
And what are the steps that we can take to show solidarity with your case, and which includes 23 other humanitarian workers?
Yeah, there are many things. The most important thing for us is that we just have this trial. We are so confident. I hope I don't eat my words come December that we will be acquitted, because let's unpack the charges perhaps a little bit. I was accused of espionage. That has two routes. The first one is that because I used WhatsApp, the prosecution said, well, you must have been trying to hide something from the authorities because it's encrypted. I mean, if we follow that logic to its conclusion, it means that
I use WhatsApp.
exactly, you're a spy, everyone's a spy. Congratulations, everyone in the audience, you're a spy. It's preposterous. It makes no sense. And the second limb of the espionage charge was that we listened to maritime radio frequencies using maritime radios. But of course, radio frequencies will be listened to by any boat out at sea, because one has to listen to radio frequencies, and a search and rescue organization will listen to open emergency broadcasts because there might be an emergency that we have to respond to. And so both of these limbs make no sense. for the espionage charge. And that's indeed why eventually it was thrown out, or one of the reasons why it was thrown out. The other charges, for example, smuggling, I faced 12 counts. For half of them, I'd never been in Greece before. It's impossible, surely, for me to drag someone across a border, as the prosecution claim I did, if I'd never even been to Greece before. And yet, that is the allegation I face. And really, for every single one of those charges, it can be dispelled in that way. So we're keen to have the trial. And as I've said, it's the prosecution that has delayed the trial. And we've seen several errors in the process to getting to trial. For example, the first indictment we received was not translated, and we have a right to receive information in a language we understand. It was missing a page. This document was missing a page. The 24 defendants were numbered and not named. So individual defendants didn't know what they were defending themselves against because they didn't know what charges they faced. It's completely preposterous. So what we're hoping is that people will stand with us, will watch this trial, and will, if they feel able to, share, the content that we have, reach out to organizations, human rights organizations, to try and just tell them what I have told you so that we can get a bit of a momentum around our trial. For example, Amnesty will come and observe trial. Several organizations, reputable human rights organizations, will come and observe trial. And all of that will put pressure on the prosecution to do the right thing. And that's all we want. All we want is that the laws that exist to be applied fairly in our case. And that the kind of procedural errors, these pages missing, this kind of ridiculous, terrible prosecution is just done professionally. And so that's what we need. If people are also able to and want to, then of course also to donate to our legal fund, because all of this is quite expensive. We have lawyers who are fantastic, but they of course come at a price. And finally, to stay active and stay involved and to care about this issue. I have given a bit of a cautionary tale in this conversation with you about how, other people can face prosecution for doing just regular old human rights work. And indeed, many people have been prosecuted. But that should not make us not do it. It should make us insist on doing it. It is only when these rights, these human rights and humanitarian activity becomes less and less commonplace and is less and less done by the authorities that we must, as civilians, do this work. And so I hope that people can get engaged and stay engaged.
Mhm. It kind of reminds me of the poem First They Came.
Hmm.
Um, I don't remember it off by heart, but I think it begins with first they came for the communists. I did not speak up because I was not a communist. Then they came for the socialists. I did not speak up because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the Jews. I did not speak up because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one to speak up for me. Um,
Yeah, exactly. And this is, I think, the perhaps the bellwether we've seen. As I said before, it is always the people who have the fewest rights who are the first to experience the hard edge of a regression or a derogation on our rule of law and human rights principles. But it doesn't end with them, precisely as the poem and as you have said. And we see this now. There is a reversion to more authoritarian, less democratic practices across the continent. Doesn't end with migrants. It starts with them. And so for selfish reasons, I'm involved in this. And for selfish reasons, we should all be involved with this because we all stand to lose something when one group's human rights are lost or forgotten or ignored.
mhm. It's also that we live in such a risk society in the world that nobody knows what's going to happen tomorrow. So it puts
Very well.
everyone at risk. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for
And
having
before we close, I'd like to remind you that Sean Binder and 23 other humanitarian volunteers trial begin on 4th of December in Lesbos. Everyone keep an eye out. Sean's experiences remind us that standing up for human rights and supporting vulnerable communities comes with profound consequences. It is our duty to demand rulings aligned with international and European laws and values that are grounded in the protection of human dignity. We hope that this inspiring conversation with Seán Binder encourages everyone to reflect on current policies and systems that criminalize compassion and inspires action to support those who continue to fight for justice and humanity. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Saff.